A keen observer of the European crisis is the former head of the World Bank, Robert Zoellick. He's in Australia as a guest of the US Studies Centre at Sydney University to mark the 10th anniversary of the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement, of which he was one of the main architects. Mr Zoellick, thank you very much for your time.
Pleased to be with you.
Let's start with the big international story of the moment, Greece. Is it now inevitable that Greece is going to exit the EU?
I don't think it'll exit the EU. It may exit the Eurozone, but that really depends on this referendum that the Greek public will have over the weekend. But to be honest, it's just a bloody mess. And you got to feel for the people of Greece, but I'm afraid this government hasn't made the situation any better. And so at the end of the day, the question is whether Greece can make some of the serious reforms that it has to make. And that's a big question mark with the current government.
There's a fair bit of distance between where the Greek government currently stands and where, say, the government of Germany stands, where the IMF stands. How is there, or can you see a path that we can resolve this situation?
I could see a path. I think the European Union and the IMF and the ECB, the European Central Bank, have tried to put together a package. They've tried to adjust to some of the needs that the Greek government has wanted to make. But frankly, I think this Greek government is just in a whole different frame of mental reference. Because of that, I'm afraid the people of Greece are going to suffer.
But then what's the option for the people of Greece? Because they've only just elected this government.
Well, they will get to exercise their choice with this referendum, and if they decide to vote yes, they're voting on a package in a sense that is no longer on the table, but most people will see the vote as a vote for staying in the Eurozone. Since the current government has recommended a no vote, if the majority vote yes, I think there's a question about whether the current government would remain in power or whether you might turn over to a group of technocrats that would try to negotiate a deal and stay in the Eurozone.
If Greeks vote no and there's not an easy resolution, what do you think the impact could be, not just throughout the European region, but also throughout the world?
Yeah, a lot of concern about this, and the frank answer is no one knows for sure. But I think what you've seen over the past couple of days is that it can be sort of moderated. There was a first hit to markets. Markets have bounced back. So in the near term, I think it's manageable. The medium and long-term question is, what does it do to the Eurozone? Because you no longer have a single currency that would be like the Australian dollar or the U.S. dollar. And there, I think one factor will be that the debt of some of the countries that have weaker economies will probably start to be differentiated with higher interest rates. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That means that the market discipline will push them towards reforms.
You're in Australia to mark the 10th anniversary of the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement, for which you were the lead negotiator at the US end. Australia now has a number of bilateral free trade agreements with other countries. Is it really right, though, to call these things free trade agreements when there are usually always numerous areas that are exempt?
Well, it depends on each agreement, and you're right that people will use the term loosely. I guess I wouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. This is an agreement that has not only expanded trade, but frankly, it's increased investment into Australia. And one of the ideas behind this agreement was frankly linking some of Australia's non-commodity-based economies with the U.S. development. So I was looking, for example, at the services trade. So beyond manufacturing goods, beyond the resource commodities. And that represents about a third of the U.S.-Australian trade, where with Korea, Japan, and China, Australia's services trade is about 6%. And a lot of the services trade will help Australia diversify its base. So this is a resource-based economy. There's no way to get around that. But with a lot of technology innovation and business services, those are the sort of things that the U.S.-Australia connection will be constructive.
10 years on, is there any scope for another look at the deal to tweak it at all, or do you think that the original deal still stands?
Well, the deal in some ways is a cornerstone of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, because the TPP is with the United States and 11 other economies. Australia is one of them. And of those 11 other economies, 6 are ones the U.S. already has free trade agreements with. So in that sense, the Australia FTA can get upgraded as part of the overall TPP. So as things get modernized, there's different challenges for example, information technology, or I suspect there'll be other provisions in some of the environment and labor areas. Those are not going to be of direct concern to Australia, although matter for some of the other economies.
On the TPP, an Australian body that does a cost-benefit analysis across a whole different range of government policies had a look. It's called the Productivity Commission. Had a look at what we know about it so far, and it says that to this juncture, there's been a critical failure of transparency. Is that a reasonable criticism?
I don't really think so. I don't know how it's done on the Australian side. In the U.S. side, every member of Congress can go look at the draft agreement. There are committees that have been set up by Congress of sort of outside experts from labor to environment to services to intellectual property to others that sort of advise in the process. To be frank, it's like if you're negotiating over something, you have to have a certain amount of openness, but obviously people have to put together a deal at the end of the day, and so many negotiations in life aren't done where you signal to the other side exactly where your bottom line is. I find that most of the criticism about transparency is a rationalization for people who want to oppose trade.
Given the example of trade and how hard it's been to reach a global agreement there, what message does that send in terms of trying to secure an agreement globally on climate change ahead of the Paris meetings later this year?
It's darn hard. And I mean, I was in Copenhagen, I was in Mexico in a role at the World Bank because we tried to create some climate investment funds. But I guess here's the analogy I would draw. If you're trying to get 190 countries to agree on something that is sort of a global arrangement of 17 different topics, is good luck. But if you go back to the original Rio Treaty of 1992, which was the last accepted treaty on climate change, which, going back, I was also had a chance to be part of, countries develop national action plans. And I think the lesson of some of those international climate change conferences is people might feel good with a great agreement, but it's not really the way national or international economies work. You have to make the practical progress on the ground. Take avoided deforestation. There was an effort that people thought this could reduce about 17% of the emissions of greenhouse gases. But all of a sudden you have to figure out, how do you measure it? What do you do with the indigenous people that live in these areas? How do you create the financial support? So that was some of the things when I was at the World Bank, we tried to help in a very practical way.
Mr. Zoellick, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure.